War II ended, there were 15 million veterans returning home. They were worried that the U.S. economy would return to like it was before the war. There would be less jobs available since the factories don't have to be open around the clock for the war effort. To help them transition back to peacetime, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill of Rights. The GI Bill gave veterans a choice on what to do with their lives. One option was buying a home or farm. Low-interest mortgages helped millions purchase their first house or some farmland. Another option was college. The GI Bill granted money to cover tuition and expenses for veterans attending a university or trade school. The third option was unemployment compensation. Nearly 9 million veterans received close to $4 billion from the bill's unemployment compensation program to help keep them going while they look for a job or started a business.
Shortly after the U.S. entered World War II, the nation's key labor leaders promised President Roosevelt that they would avoid strikes during the war so as not to interrupt the nation's defense production. During this period, unions won many important fringe benefits, and their membership soared. Truman asked Congress to continue the price controls of wartime in order to hold inflation in check. Instead, Congress relaxed the controls of the Office of Price Administration, and 25% inflation was the first-year result. Over 4.5 million workers decided to go on strike in 1946 to allow wages to catch up after years of wage controls. When the mine workers went on strike threatening national safety, Truman seized control of the mines using soldiers to keep them operating until the United Mine Workers finally called off the strike. Unhappy with inflation and strikes, voters elected the Republicans to take control of both houses of Congress. They enacted the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 to check the growing power of unions, which many believe were influenced by communists. Truman vetoed the bill, calling it a slave labor bill, but Congress overrode his veto. The Taft-Hartley Act amended the Wagner Act of 1935 and did the following. Number one, it guaranteed the right not to join a union. Number two, it required unions to give 60 days notice if they're going to go on strike. And finally, it required union officers to deny communist affiliations. After serving most of Roosevelt's fourth term in office, Truman ran for his first election for president. The presidential election of 1948 is considered by most historians as the greatest election upset in American history. Virtually every prediction, with or without public opinion polls, indicated that incumbent President Harry S. Truman would be defeated by Republican Thomas E. Dewey. Truman won, overcoming a three-way split in his own party. Truman's surprise victory was the fifth consecutive win for the Democratic Party in a presidential election. As a result of the 1948 congressional election, the Democrats would regain control of both houses of Congress. Thus, Truman's election confirmed the Democratic Party's status as the nation's majority party, a status they would retain until 1952. After FDR's death, President Harry Truman tried to continue his New Deal policies. Truman called for an expanded Social Security, a law raising wages and limiting hours, public housing, and a permanent Fair Employment Practices Act to prevent racial or religious discrimination in hiring. A more conservative Congress largely ignored the Fair Deal. They were more concerned with inflation and converting to a peacetime economy. Congress did pass the Employment Act, which established a Council of Economic Advisors to help guarantee a continuing healthy economy. Congress also raised the minimum wage and extended Social Security benefits to 10 million more Americans. In August 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests its first atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning. The Soviets constructed buildings, bridges, and other structures to measure the effects of the blast. They also placed animals in cages nearby to test the effects on mammals. The atomic explosion, which was roughly equal to the Trinity test by the U.S., destroyed the structures and incinerated the animals. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who'd worked on the Manhattan Project, was later arrested for passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets. He had given the Soviets precise information about the U.S. atomic program, including a blueprint of the Fat Man atomic bomb dropped on Japan. These events pushed President Truman to order the development of the hydrogen bomb. After World War II, the Soviet Army occupied the northern half of the Korean Peninsula, a Japanese territory since 1910. They set up a provisional communist government in 1946, nationalizing key industries and reorganizing the economy. The U.S. set up a democratic government in 1948 in the South, holding a general election and established the Republic of Korea. On June 25, 1950, the Korean War began when 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army poured across the 38th parallel, the boundary between Soviet-backed North Korea and pro-Western South Korea.
This was the first military action of the Cold War fought by the U.S. to contain the spread of communism. By July, American-led UN troops had entered the war on South Korea's behalf. They landed at Incheon and Pusan in September of 1950. UN troops were able to push the North Koreans out of South Korea. They continued to push north until Chinese forces launched a counterattack that pushed them back into South Korea. After some back and forth across the 38th parallel, the fighting stalled and casualties mounted, leading to a stalemate. Finally, in July of 1953, an armistice was signed, bringing the Korean War to an end and creating a demilitarized border close to the original boundary. Close to 5 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives during the war. The Korean Peninsula is still divided today.
In the early 1950s, American leaders repeatedly told the public that they should be fearful of revolutionary communist influence in their lives. Communists could be lurking anywhere, using their positions as school teachers, college professors, labor organizers, artists, or journalists to aid the program of world communist domination. This paranoia about the internal communist threat was known as the Red Scare. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, a committee of the U.S. House of Representatives, investigated allegations of communist activity in the U.S. during the early years of the Cold War. Established in 1938, the committee called citizens to testify in high-profile hearings before Congress. The HUAC often intimidated witnesses, producing questionable information about the spread of communism in America. The HUAC's controversial tactics contributed to the fear and distrust that existed during the Second Red Scare of the 1950s. The HUAC's primary target was Hollywood entertainment industry. Actors, screenwriters, directors, musicians, and other entertainment professionals were forced to testify in hearings before Congress. They had to answer questions about their loyalty to the U.S. and whether they belonged to the Communist Party. Many of them refused to testify, using their Fifth Amendment rights to avoid incriminating themselves. Those unwilling to cooperate were blacklisted, meaning they were unable to find jobs in the entertainment field for many years. In late September 1947, the HUAC called 79 individuals to testify based on a claim that they had connections to the Communist Party. Only 10 appeared before the committee. They became known as the Hollywood 10. They were very combative, resisting the authority of the HUAC, yelling at committee members and acting unruly. They were held in contempt and fined $1,000 each, as well as 6 months to 1 year in jail for their behavior in the hearings. Alger Hiss was a prominent official in the State Department who assisted FDR at the Yalta Conference. Whittaker Chambers, a confessed communist, accused Hiss of giving him secret documents. Alger Hiss denied the allegations, but with the help of Richard Nixon was convicted of perjury and sent to prison.
When the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, many Americans were convinced that spies had helped them steal the technology from the U.S. Klaus Fuchs, a British scientist who worked on the Manhattan Project, admitted to giving A-bomb secrets to the Russians. Aided by the British, an FBI investigation traced another spy ring to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in New York. Their report was known as the Winona Papers. After a controversial trial in 1951, the Rosenbergs were found guilty of treason and executed for the crime in 1953. Civil rights advocates raised questions about whether anti-communist hysteria had played a role in the conviction and punishment of the Rosenbergs.
In February of 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin presented a list of alleged members of the Communist Party that worked in the U.S. State Department. This added to the hysteria of the Red Scare and the Cold War. McCarthy headed the investigation of suspected communists in the U.S. government. Hundreds of Americans were accused of either being communist or communist sympathizers. The primary targets were government employees, those in the entertainment industry, teachers and professors, and labor union activists. Many people were fired or blacklisted, mostly without any real evidence to back up the claim. McCarthyism became the term that meant making accusations of treason without any real evidence to support it. The presidential election of 1952 took place at an era when Cold War tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was escalating rapidly. Senator McCarthy's so-called witch hunt, combined with national tension and weariness after 2 years of bloody stalemate in the Korean War and the early 1950s recession, set the stage for a hotly fought presidential contest. Unpopular incumbent President Harry Truman decided not to run, so the Democratic Party instead nominated Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois. Stevenson had gained a reputation in Illinois as an intellectual and an eloquent orator. The Republican Party countered with popular war hero General Dwight D. Eisenhower and won in a landslide, ending 20 consecutive years of Democratic control of the White House.